Welcome, good people. I'm John Munitz.
And I'm Jackie Sawicki, and we're the People's Basics. John and I are here to break down another societal basic and how we get there for everyone.
Yeah, so today's topic that we're going to be covering is democracy reform. And so there's a lot of aspects of democracy reform that we're going to be looking to cover today. We're going to be starting off by discussing, why is democracy such a fun foundational basic? We're going to then get into some of the issues and solutions, the first of which is the For the People Act, one of the landmark legislations passed from the previous Congress of democracy reform. We're going to be talking about the census, given that the census was conducted last year and there have been some delays, and this has implications on our democracy in general. Then we're going to be talking about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Ranked Choice Voting Act, the Democracy Vouchers Act, term limits, how we actually run our primary system, the Electoral College and the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, the National Annual Referendum as a concept, as well as the SAFE Act, which is helping get paper ballots. So, Jackie, I think the first thing we got to talk about is, why is democracy so vital? In your opinion, why do you think democracy is such a basic foundational principle that all people should have?
Well, personally, I think it was Socrates that said the punishment for not participating in politics is to be ruled by your inferiors. So when we talk about, the government, we're really talking about ourselves. So if the government isn't doing great, it's maybe because we haven't been doing our job in holding them accountable, running ourselves. Democracy is a participatory system of governance. So I think we all need to be involved in some form or fashion, and there's a lot of things that we can do, but it's important because our government in a democracy is a reflection of us and our values and what we believe in and what we want. So if those people aren't in there, then we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me of why I think democracy is so important is two things. One, I see democracy as a foundational pillar to freedom itself. Without the ability to have some level of stakeholdership in the decision-making process of who is making decisions, we are simply being dictated to from people without any say of how things are operated. And that is not freedom. That is us having to follow the commands of the higher ups without any say. So I think it's first foundational to freedom to be able to give an input and potentially be able to change the leadership who is making commands over the land. The second thing of why democracy is so important to me is, as you just said, not all rulers are particularly competent individuals, particularly in the monarchies of passing down from generation to generation. You are inevitably going to be run into an incompetent leader along the throne, filled with spoils and privilege and not really learning from hard work how to build themselves up. And so in democracy, it's basically this concept of kind of like a hive mind. You have many thoughts having their different lived experiences, which helps inform what is needed. What are the priorities for this country that are supposed to be put forward by representation? And so I think democracy is vital. And so right now, America itself, has its own form of it in a representative democracy, a republic, where we elect our officials and then they make decisions on our behalf. And sometimes, frankly, we don't even get the actual say on picking. It sometimes comes from the parties. So sometimes people have this caveat of saying that America truly isn't a democracy. But here's the thing. Maybe it's a republic now, but maybe we want to go to a democracy. And so direct democracy measures, as we'll cover later, might be a part of that fold. In true democracy, the invention of democracy came from Athens in, I don't forget the specific year, but in the Athenian democracy, it essentially was a direct democracy model where people would simply come together in mass and be able to have a forum on the issues and then vote as a society. So I think we should have more measures where more people get stakeholdership in general. So I think that is the reason why.
I visited the seat of democracy in Greece when I went. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I think it's an awesome venture. I've never gotten to go myself, but I hope to do that someday. But I think the first thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to democracy reform is a little bit more of like where we are today and what have been some of the big proposals that have been put forward on a federal level to address it. The first of which is the For the People Act. This was something that had been introduced in, I believe it was 2018. It could have been 2019. I know it was from the past congressional session. I'm going to say 2019 because that's when the new Congress comes in. And the act was introduced by John Sarbanes. It had basically a couple components to it. It tried to focus on voting rights, election security, campaign finance reform, ethics reform, DC statehood, gerrymandering, and increasing the number of federal election commissioners. So when it came to voting rights, some of the key provisions that were added into this bill included same-day voter registration. It would require early voting for at least 15 days, establish automatic voter registration. It would establish Election Day as a federal holiday. It would expand funding to help vote by mail efforts. And it would instruct basically, like the bill would make it a criminal offense to corruptly like hinder or interfere with or prevent another person from registering to vote. It would basically establish criminal penalties for basically this voter disenfranchisement effort. It would also authorize 16 and 17-year-olds to actually be able to register in advance for becoming 18. So as well, the final thing that it really like focuses on is making sure that it restores voting rights to felons who have completed their prison terms. So, Jackie, talking about voting rights, how do you feel about some of those things that are currently part of the voting rights part of the For the People Act?
I love it because, we had historic turnout this last election, and that was due a lot in part to COVID and making things a little more accommodating for people because of the pandemic. And in turn, we got historic turnout. So the moral of that story was when you make it easier for people to vote, more people vote. So I feel like, we have really abysmal voter turnout compared to other developed countries. And again, democracy is participatory. Like the very least we can do is voting. So we should be encouraging, making it easier, making it more accessible. So anything we do that makes it easier to vote and vote legitimately, of course. But as we all know, like voting fraud is like very, very small, and it's really hard. I went through poll worker training, and the backstops. Once you're in the system and it says you voted, you don't get to vote again, even if somebody pretended to be you. So it's just really, really difficult to commit voter fraud, and it's overblown, and we need to be making it easier, not harder for people to vote.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think the main reason why it's important that like more people vote is you end up getting better results. Like on average, we did an episode back at the Hill of Roses days where I talked about conscription voting, basically the idea of having mandatory voting. And in that episode, we basically broke down how you see that the nations that have higher voter participation rates generally also rate higher when it comes to national happiness. And I'd imagine part of that is that they feel represented and they feel that their country is actually doing what would help them because, well, they're being represented. And that is such an important process in general. So I think, yes, we need to be making sure that more people can vote. And voter fraud, I don't think anyone on the left denies that some voter fraud exists. Some, but not a like significant. It is largely negligible. I believe the quoted rate of voter fraud is 0.00004%. So
less than 1% wouldn't make a difference in a real election.
Yeah.
For the most part.
So yeah, like a couple, maybe dozen votes in the past national election were voter fraud. I'll maybe grant it that, but that is not swinging an election. A couple dozen. It's just not. And so it's an overblown fear that just ends up doing more voter disenfranchisement. And I would say that's basically like voter fraud. It's like, hey, this person could have been a vote here, but now the vote has basically become nil. that's kind of like a voter fraud, especially when it's very clearly targeted at communities of color. And specifically, we had seen that, like, especially in like areas like Texas. I know you are very familiar from living in Texas. They had limited a lot of the voting areas, especially in urban areas, to very limited amounts. I believe it was like one per county. So yeah, that is an unacceptable method of denying people a say in how their country operates.
Yeah, I mean, we saw such overt voter suppression this last cycle with the mail being corrupted and slowed down. With in Texas, they limited ballot boxes. I think it was district, not even county. I could be wrong. It was county or district, but only one ballot drop box. So, you know, some of these, I think Fort Worth has like 900,000 people, you know, and there's so many ways that they disenfranchise and suppress and keep people from voting. They'll have disinformation campaigns about what day to vote, and it'll be like the wrong date. I mean, some just really sneaky stuff, overt, covert, all, you know, across. And what does it say about your party when you have to lie, cheat and steal, you know, in order to win? So again, what we learned is when more people vote and we make it easier, more people vote, more people kind of vote a little more progressive, liberal, whatever, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense when you just think about who in general has higher voter participation rates. And the people who are more likely to participate are people who are upper middle class and affluent, because it's easier for them to be able to take time off, to be able to go work. And it's more easy for them to potentially secure things like childcare to be able to go out and vote. Furthermore, we have, frankly, along those same lines, money tends to follow race in America because we have wealth inequality on racial lines. And so that lends communities of color, specifically Black and Hispanic communities, to not be able to vote at the same rates as white communities. And so when you look at who generally votes for which parties, poor people, people of color, generally vote more often for the Democrats. And so when we are able to have more people vote, that helps those groups turn out more. But I want to now move on to another part of the For the People Act. So we talked through the voting rights portion, but the next part of it is election security. And so the big thing that it tries to do on election security is it tries to make sure that there are voter verified paper ballots. So it basically is a process to just make sure that we can have a record of paper ballots, potentially even archived, so that if there are any needs for, let's say, recounts or audits, that it is possible to have hand-counted paper ballots available for that. And it would also require that voting machines used in all federal elections have to be manufactured in the United States. How do you feel about those measures?
I'm shaking my head because I just was transported back to the year 2000 and hanging chads and, you know, just again, the amount of voter suppression and fraud that went into the 2000 elections when seniors in Florida were, you know, trying to vote for Al Gore, and it was going to like Buchanan, who was just the opposite, you know, of Al Gore. And when we talk about voter fraud, it's happening almost from the inside. And I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but like there's a forensic digital forensic person on Twitter that her last name's Cohen, but she's been following the digital voting machine scandal, and like you said, there's no paper ballots, so there is like some of the people who didn't want paper ballots are like the people buying these machines, like McConnell, that kind of stuff. Like it was almost shocking that Biden won, but people like McConnell still, you know, stayed in power. And you have to wonder, and again, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but there has been a precedent. The 2000 election was just so squirrely, and there was, you know, there was a whistleblower that came on to like out in the public and said, you can totally, you know, insert a virus or bug, you can mess with these machines, and the whole like being connected to the internet or not, like there's just so many ways that, you know, bad actors can infiltrate our voting system and it's not just Joe Schmo on the, on the streets. It's sophisticated, kind of, almost. Did Russia interfere with our elections in 2016? Like I mean, just, it's very disturbing to think that maybe our elections aren't as secure as we think they are. And the least we can do is say, hey, I want my receipt. I want to see who I actually voted for. And you don't get that. In Texas, I ask for it. It's like almost a gag at this point. But when I vote, I say, can I have like proof of who I voted for? And they're like, we don't do that. And I'm like, I know, but I
Oh
still have to
yeah.
ask.
Yeah, frankly, I love the idea of just having a receipt. It's not necessarily a part of this amendment, but it is something that I frankly had supported myself. And it's not even necessarily I want it to be something where I get a receipt, like you were just saying, like, hey, after I voted, like, just give me my receipt. I want to know, like, this receipt once it was counted. Like, I want to make sure not just that the system registered where did I vote, but that, like, hey, when it's officially going to the tally, that I'm notified that my vote was counted, because I worry about potentially, like, the people who like put provisional ballots. So often people are like, are those being counted?
Yeah.
And so a lot of this is just, it's not even to say that, like, I know there was, you were just speculating a little bit, like, hey, did Russia hack our elections or not? And so I just think it's like, even if that's not necessarily happening, you want to kind of put that fear to bed.
Yeah.
And give people some, like, general
Security.
trust.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, I don't want to go as far as saying, like, hey, like you said, like, oh, it's fishy. How did Mitch McConnell keep his seat, despite, like, Biden winning?
Yeah.
In that case, it's more like, hey, Biden didn't win Kentucky himself either. But it's just, I think we need to just build up trust, because as we just saw from the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, if people don't have inherent trust in the system, it's going to lead to more polarization and potentially violence. Even if it's unfounded, it still needs to be addressed, that people feel confident that we have built a system that is integrity based.
Yeah.
But let me go on now to the next part of the For the People Act. The next part is campaign finance reform. So it would basically introduce a voluntary public financing campaign, matching small donations at 6-to-1 ratio. It's kind of similar to what we have currently in New York City at a 9-to-1 ratio. Basically, you give up to, let's say, $200. That's considered the cap at, like, a small dollar donation. And the government would match that by adding an additional $1,200 on top of that. This really allows people who don't have as much money to spend to be able to have their money make a bigger difference and to not be drowned out by big money interests. Another thing that it does is it incorporates a finance reform provisions from the Disclose Act, which would basically impose, like, stricter limitations on foreign lobbying. So think about the groups like AIPAC that are trying to influence on behalf of Israel. There are lobbies on behalf of each nation out there.
Yeah.
It would further require super PACs and other dark money organizations to disclose their donors. Usually when they say dark money organizations, they're just talking like political 501c4s, and restructure the FEC to reduce partisan gridlock. The bill expresses basically a constitutional amendment, like it's like a resolution to have a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United as well. So they wouldn't necessarily, like, fully overturn Citizens United, but it would basically say that a role of government right now is to eliminate Citizens United. So how do you feel about those campaign finance reforms? My first impression is that, like, a lot of them are good. It doesn't go as far as I'd like, but I like the measures that are in there right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so gross that money is in politics at all whatsoever. And it's even optics wise, even if it isn't corrupting, which people can say, oh, they've done studies and it's not corrupting. And even the illusion, the whiff of money and corruption in politics, people do not like it across the board. Overwhelmingly, almost all Americans do not want money in politics. And we know that, like, politicians spend so much time begging for money when they should be, like, legislating and being an active participant in their community, but they're in their office dialing for dollars, and it doesn't go far enough. I mean, they sound nice, but, like, why unlock money? How about just take it all away? And we have, I mean, I want some kind of like central database, which like Ballotpedia is really cool. It's close to that, but you go in, you say where you are, they show you the ballot, you can click around, see what the people are, and maybe don't even say Republican or Democrat or not, just what they stand for, what you stand for, who best represents you. And there's no money needed in that, and I mean the people's actions, they're like incumbencies, that should speak for themselves. Like what have they done for us? Do we even know? I mean, it's kind of a part of education too. Like, are people even interested enough to
Yeah.
want to go to a website, or do they want to just be fed fear mongering ads all for like 3 months?
That's very true. Yeah, it is like, is it truly just the politicians, or is that like also a part of the people side? But I think about it this way too. Like why that's so essential. Like, you said like they'll say, oh, it doesn't corrupt people. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily every time a quid pro quo, like here's money, do X for me. What it more often is you're going after these types of donors. And so that kind of influences your circles and where you spend your time and who you're listening to in general. And so it's not necessarily a, hey, you need to do this for me if you want my financial backing. It's more just like a natural influence to try and please those interests, because that's the circle you're hanging around and that's who has the money. So it's a weird incentive. And the one thing I would say is a little lackluster in the For the People Act, when it comes to campaign finance reform, is that it doesn't start off the money train of putting good money in. It does this idea of matching small dollar donations, which is good, but you can only have your donation matched if you have money to give in the first place.
Right.
And a lot of people, are not willing to give up any money right now to politics because they just need it for their basic living expenses. And so the idea is, and we're going to go into this in more depth in a second, is give people money that's specifically allocated to this, and they're going to become more willing to donate into the system in general too. So that's my biggest issue with the campaign finance reform there. I have other minor things, like I think, frankly, just disclosure of super PAC money is not enough. I think you should be deeply inconveniencing how they operate and spread information. Basically, the kind of model that Republicans generally use to try and restrict abortion rights, trying to kill it by 1,000 paper cuts, essentially. We should be trying to do the same to super PACs. And so I don't think it does enough to regulate the super PACs. But let's go on to another portion of this, because there's a lot in the For the People Act, and we have a lot to cover in general in democracy reform. So the next one is ethics. So the bill would require that the president and vice president, as well as just presidential and vice presidential candidates, to publicly disclose their previous 10 years of income tax returns. The bill would also eliminate the use of taxpayer money by members of Congress to settle any employment discrimination claims, by requiring members of Congress to reimburse the Treasury for any such payments. Another part of the bill would require judicial conference to establish rules of ethics binding on the Supreme Court of the United States, which is the only court in the U.S. without a binding canon of judicial ethics. And then finally, the legislation will also set new disclosure rules and limitations on presidential inaugural committees. Basically, inaugural committees would be barred from taking money from corporations. A contribution limit to the inaugural committees of $50,000 per person would be imposed. Contributions of more than $1,000 would have to be disclosed within 1 day. And the use of funds donated to inaugural committees would be restricted only to use for inaugural events and for charitable contributions. So, in terms of ethics, how do you feel about these measures? Do you think these would help us have more ethical government?
I mean, again, it's just so grotesque that everything you're talking about is in relation to money. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's just like, what does the inaugural fund have anything to do? I mean, that is really kind of disturbing. So what are you saying, that a lot of inaugural money isn't actually going to the inauguration, and it's not being spent the way that it's supposed to be spent? I mean, this is what I'm talking. We have to get money out completely, because as long as those tentacles of dollars are in any branch of government. It is corrupting. It's a corrupting influence, and it's like advertising. They don't spend billions of dollars on advertising for no reason. It works. The same thing is why these corporations. I love opensecrets.org, opensecrets.org. You can look by industry, by candidate, by election, and see who's spending, and it's buku buckos, and it's both parties. That's why I'm not a super fan of either one, even though I'm really not a fan of one. But it's just gross. And until money is completely out of politics, we're not going to have a government for, of, and by the people. We have a government for, of, and by the corporations and by the elite 1%, whatever you want to call it. So it's not a government for us. They don't make the rules for us. They don't protect us. They are at every turn, they're asking themselves, what is going to be best for the people that put us here in the first place?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And I do completely agree with you. We do have to get the dark money out. But I actually think the only way you get the dark money out is if you first put the good money in. Because we need this general empowerment to be able to compete with the dark money. And so I think things like we're going to talk about later, like the Democracy Vouchers Act, is a good way to potentially get that out. I think, frankly, in terms of ethics, the thing that, like, frankly strikes me here as, like, very important in terms of just democracy itself, because I think, like, some of these other things are, like, after the fact, like, the people have already voted them in, and now it's, like, more of a governing and making sure they stay, like, ethical. And another one's, like, kind of part of the court system, which isn't as much democracy itself. But the part that touches democracy itself is having to disclose income tax returns for at least 10 years, because it gives voters a form of transparency into their candidates to know, well, what have they been doing in the past? What influences might they have? Did they take any speaking fees from any groups? These things are very helpful for people to truly understand their candidates. My only concern is how much good does it do? Like, the only thing is, like,
are people gonna care?
Yeah, like, no one's gonna actually read the, like, few people are gonna read the income tax return. Like,
the journalists are gonna read it for us.
Yeah, I already, like, am dreading the fact that I have to do my own taxes soon. I'm not gonna go ahead and read someone else's. But yeah, you're gonna get journalists who are gonna start reporting on it. And the problem is, like, it's like, well, then you have the whole, like, media reform thing. Like, are the people who need to hear this transparent information going to hear it? And that's the whole thing. So
yeah, is it being interpreted?
Yeah, it's like
bipartisan.
I don't feel like any of these measures are bad per se.
Yeah,
it's just like, I don't think it's going to do a significant overhaul of ethics in general. It's really, as we were just saying, it's getting the money out that's going to do the biggest thing to help with the ethics.
Yeah.
So let's now go on to the next part of it, which is statehood. They want to make statehood for the District of Columbia. Yes. They basically say the 2019 version of this was admitting the District of Columbia as a state, affirming Congress's power to create a new state in the populated area that's now DC, while retaining a separate federal district comprising the Capitol complex. So the Capitol itself would kind of be its own zone, and they would take all of the residential area and turn it into a state.
Yeah.
So I would like to hear how you feel about this, because I think there are legitimate cases for and against this, frankly. Because my personal case is that I think instead of just making it its own state, just put the population with Maryland. Like, you can separate it, and Maryland will now gain extra power from the additional population, and these people will now have a say, but you don't need to create just a whole new state for it. How do you feel? Do you think it should be a state?
I mean, that's what they want. I think the people of DC want to be a state, and it is kind of another way to suppress the vote, because there is a predominantly minority, like a huge minority population in DC, and they don't really have representation, but they're taxed. So, I mean, there is a big a big push to do it. And so, yeah, I support it. I mean, I hadn't heard the just becoming part of Maryland part, but I don't think that's what the people in DC want. I think they want to be a state, and I'm totally for that.
I think, like, obviously, I don't think either of us like live in DC, but
Yeah,
I'd imagine like most people like want the inherent benefits of being a state, not necessarily being one's own state per se.
yeah,
Like they want that voting rights and representation. I don't know if they necessarily need to be a state themselves, but I think the one upside that I do see with the idea of going with a statehood approach compared to trying to move the population into Maryland is that you don't need Maryland's approval. And that's I guess a good thing.
yeah,
Like maybe Maryland Republicans would fight that hard because, frankly, most of DC is a very heavy Democratic population.
yeah,
Not
yeah,
sure, but it would basically avoid that one hurdle. But it would have its own hurdle, obviously.
right,
Of it's still difficult to form a state, but this
yeah,
bill would do that. And so I would love to try and get extra representation for the people of DC. They certainly deserve that. Let's go to the next part, gerrymandering. So the bill would basically thwart gerrymandering by requiring states to use independent commissions to draw congressional district lines, except in the 7 states with only one congressional district. Obviously, you don't have to draw any lines if there's only one.
right,
But, you know, this is basically just saying you need to have an independent commission, and the bill would basically require the commissions to draw congressional districts on a 5-part criteria. 1 is population equality. 2 is compliance with the Voting Rights Act. 3 is compliance with additional racial requirements. 4 is respect for political subdivisions and communities of interest. And 5 is no undue advantage for any party. How do you feel about that? Do you think the way we handle gerrymandering is just through independent commissions, or is there another approach you would want to go with?
I mean, I'd love that if it's actually independent, and because we're supposed to be representative. And I've been saying for like years and years and years, if you take a snapshot of anywhere that you live, for the most part, especially if you live in a big city, take a snapshot of 100 people and then go compare that to their representatives, and it's going to be a stark contrast. And it's gotten a lot better in recent history, but I really feel like they are doing everything in their power, to keep control. And this is why there is this almost hysteria about Caucasians becoming the minority. Like they're terrified of losing power, but it's not like anything bad is going to happen to them. It just means good stuff is going to happen for other people because they'll finally get representation. So I remember living in Richardson, Texas. I believe it was a 2004 election, but I feel it was one of the last Democrats in that area at the time. They gerrymandered him out of the House of Representatives. And even bipartisan, he was a really beloved, his last name was Frost, was a beloved representative. People on both sides of the aisle loved him and worked with him. But there is this insatiable quest for ultimate power and to like control everything and make all the rules. And again, it's like, who are they making the rules for? And so, Texas is really diverse, and it should be representative. Our representatives should show that. And we say all the time, representation matters on the screen, in books, but especially we're in our legislature.
Yeah, I think like the rule of thumb for myself that I think is the easiest way for people to understand why gerrymandering is a problem is that the whole system of government is supposed to be the people pick the politicians. The politicians aren't supposed to be picking the people.
Yes.
That's the fundamental problem. And
yes.
You just gave a great example of how it can be easily politicized to be able to potentially kill people's districts off that might be more Democratic leaning. And furthermore, it leads to a lot of, frankly, hyperpartisanship in the country, because if an area is securely just for one party, well, then all they ever have to worry about is the primary. And most often, whoever is more to the left, if it's a Democrat, and more to the right, if it's a Republican, usually in general will prosper in primaries. And so that is a big thing that we need to take into account. And frankly, one of the big ways they try and frankly skew things towards their advantage is, well, they look at racial data. And they try to basically carve out Black communities in ways where it's like, hey, we're taking enough from you here, so you don't have enough to win fully, and we're taking enough from you, like in both areas. They're basically splitting them up and dividing those communities. And that, to me, seems wrong. And the reason I like an independent commission specifically is because it does provide a little level of flexibility in method so that it can kind of adapt over time. Like, essentially, there are some models, like especially like having it just be basically drawn. It's like the least lines model is one approach that people like. And it's basically a computer will just draw the lines, and it's like AI generated. And I think there does need to be some level of like human adjustment. Like there is a margin for there. And so I think that level of adaptability of having a commission is important. And I would want to see like how they like do oversight to make sure that the commissions that each state sets up is truly independent.
Right.
I hadn't necessarily gotten to see those details, so it's good, but I don't know. It's like I have some questions there. I think it is an important issue to address, and it might be something where it's like you do it, you see where some of the little issues come up, and then you work from there, fixing those holes.
Yeah, it's super important, especially with these primaries. I mean, the midterms coming up. The Republicans have already presented over 100 laws suppressing the vote in some form or fashion, and then they have big plans for gerrymandering. Yeah. So this next midterm election is going to be really important, and they're already working on suppressing people's vote, and that is gerrymandering by any other word. It's suppression. It's voter suppression.
Yeah. So let's now go on to the final part of the For the People Act before we take a quick break and then come back with more democracy reform measures we want to talk about, and then conclude with our final part of an interview with Adam Christensen. So the final part of the For the People Act is the number of federal election commissioners. Under the current law, the FEC has only 6 members, no more than 3 of whom can be members of the same political party, with at least 4 votes required for any official FEC action. The complaint is that this has resulted in an important and gridlocked FEC, with important reforms left like unaddressed, such as updating of campaign finance law for the digital age and effective regulation on political donations. Some advocates reforms have blamed like Republican FEC members for unwillingness to investigate any potential violations or to impose tougher restrictions. And for also like loosening restrictions simply by like signaling what standards they're going to actually enforce. Basically, the proposed bill would give the FEC 5 commissioners instead of 6, which would reduce the likelihood of tie votes and require that no more than 2 members can be members of the same political party. That's actually a very important deal, because that means that you're going to have that 5th member. They could be a third party member. They could just be an independent. That's going to give some extra representation compared to the just 2-party system duopoly of controlling who gets enforced on. So like that is a big deal to they basically breaking up the gridlock.
Sure.
Who could think that just removing one commissioner could do so much? But it really can, because split votes is the most common thing when you say, okay, 6 votes and you have to have it divided by each side, 3-3.
Yeah, 5 doesn't sound like, number one, I think I have a problem with the 5 number. It's too small, I think. We can have an odd number, but let's have more people, because that's an awful lot of power concentrated into 5 people. And then 5 people, you probably aren't going to get that much representation of the population. So we get more 7 or 9 or 11, still, odd number. You have the likelihood, the opportunity to get a lot more diversity on the board. So, yeah, I think that it's too small. I think it should probably be bigger. Yeah.
I completely agree with you. Frankly, it's not just the getting more diverse voices into the room. It's also the ability to potentially investigate more claims.
Yeah,
Having more
that's what I
people
was
to
thinking.
review things too.
Yeah, you could
Yeah,
delegate, have different committees overseeing other things. Yeah, like just you're talking about gridlock, and you want to take one person away. That sounds like even more gridlock.
yeah, and the funny thing is, like, now that we've gone through all the portions, I kind of find it interesting, like how the Republicans tried to basically attack this bill. They basically just said, and I think personally, like having gone through each of these parts so far, this is a very revealing reason. They say it's a one-sided power grab. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
that is their main reason. They're saying, "Oh, these people are just playing politics just to grab power." And as we just talked about before, if you're just
How do
helping people
you?
who are suppressed voters be able to vote,
Yeah.
and those people are more likely to vote for you because the other side wants to suppress your voters.
Yeah. The
Yeah, it
felon
might
thing
seem like
is
one-sided to you, but it's like the same thing that people say, like, doing things to help Black and brown Americans achieve equality in this country is
right.
oppression towards white people.
Right.
God, that is such a privileged
And
perspective, and this is the
that's what
same
I was
damn thing.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. Just because something good is happening for people of color and minorities doesn't mean that it's taking anything away from you. So when you think about that, what are you really saying? Is that the only way that you can have power is by suppressing and oppressing others and
And
putting
by
people
taking big money and all these other
right?
things, yeah,
Yeah. So
that's
and we
revealing.
didn't talk about this very much, but I do want to say the having your vote taken away from you because you've been found guilty of a felony, we know that this
Yeah,
disproportionately affects people of color and minority communities because, you know, more affluent people can afford lawyers to get out of those things.
yep.
So there's that. And then also, there's a really important book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, and she lays out the case that a lot of people are fraudulently arrested. A lot of people are innocent, and there have been proven, rogue squads of police officers planting evidence. That was a big scandal in the Oakland Police Department. So there are a lot of people who have been disenfranchised by, being found guilty of a felon. When again, most people in prison are nonviolent drug offenders. So we need to talk about that too when we talk about suppression of our
Yep.
votes. And the census, people in prison, are they counted? There's a whole lot of gray area there, and that again, that's a way to suppress people's votes. So if you don't have the ability to vote and have representation, then you shouldn't pay taxes, because that's one of the founding principles, right? No
Yeah.
taxation without representation. So if felons can't vote, then they shouldn't have to pay taxes either. That's my
No, that's a
simplify.
very reasonable opinion. I would much rather prefer that they can vote and still pay their
Yeah,
taxes,
and not
but
not disenfranchise them.
yeah, exactly. But it's a very, I think, reasonable standard. And I think the final thing I'd like to say on that very point you brought up is that this past cycle, this actually had some pretty important implications. One of the things that happened was we had these a mass movement that involved many protests around the country for Black Lives Matter. And we had on several occasions, I think particularly in like the western states, I think it was even like in Colorado. I need to fact check myself on this, so everyone take a grain of salt on this, but you can look up the story. There were particular state officials who were looking to make laws to basically throw people in jail for these protests and strip them of their voting rights. And so I think to myself, like, hey, if people are allowed to just be thrown in jail because of protesting, which again, that's a whole other thing. Like, that seems weird that we even have that as a thing. Like, that's supposed to be a constitutional right. But granted, that was happening. And
Yeah.
so if we're saying protests of the government can get us arrested and lose our vote, that's of course how you disenfranchise your opposition. Like,
And
oh,
how you
you're
become a
protesting me? Oh,
yeah.
good luck. You have no say anymore. You're thrown in
Yeah.
jail and we're taking your vote away.
And you want to talk about
Blatant
tyranny.
authoritarianism.
Yes, exactly. Like that is a straight path to the worst case scenarios. Yeah.
Yeah, completely. So I think this is a great point for us to take a little bit of a break. We're going to be right back with some talk about the census, the Electoral College, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Ranked Choice Voting Act, Democracy Vouchers Act, term limits, the primaries, and the National Annual Referendum. So be right back, y'all. Come join us soon. Okay, we're back. So we had just wrapped up talking about the For the People Act and its different components. We're now going to be talking about a wide variety of democracy reform issues in our second part before getting to our final part of an interview with Adam Christensen, where we talk tactics of how we get these reforms done, as well as the value of data. So I think the first part of things that we have to cover is, again, stuff that's more present to this year. We had the census administered in 2020 with some delays, and that can have vital impacts on our democracy because that is how, populations are counted, and that's how we decide how many electors each state gets and how many districts and House of Representatives members they get when we do our new Apportionment Act. And so the census is frankly a big issue right now because it's been getting basically delayed because during 2020, we also had a global pandemic. So my headphone fell out. Let me just grab that. We're back. So yeah, it basically had the global pandemic. This caused an extraordinarily condensed timeline while also basically facing unprecedented levels of political interference as well. The COVID-19 pandemic basically put the census months behind with data collection, which was delayed because census workers were scheduled to go door to door just as the pandemic began to escalate dramatically. I know a lot of people do it online. I got to do my census online, and I encourage people. I think it's even at this point, I think they're still allowing census enrollments. I need to verify that, but I know they had extended the period of time in which it was being collected because of these delays. But a lot of people, they don't have that internet access. Not everyone has broadband. And so to be able to make sure everyone is included in the census, one of the activities is they send in-person people, and that's harder to do during a pandemic. So, rather than ask Congress for an extension of the deadlines to collect and finalize the data, the U.S. Department of Commerce and Census bureaus officially had initially requested the Trump administration reverse course. And they're now racing to pack 5 months worth of data processing and error correction into 2 months, which basically raised bureau concerns that there might be serious errors that might not be fixed. And then, over the past year, the Trump administration has, tripled the number of political appointees to the Census Bureau from 3 to 9, which basically injected an additional political interference into the agency that had previously, been overwhelmingly guided by career professionals. And he did this mainly because he wanted to include citizenship questions on the census. And so I think this goes right in line with, again, the idea of the Electoral College, because, as I said before, the main impact of this is counting the populations, which impacts how many electors each of these states get, and frankly, the amount of funding they get. But the Electoral College basically says, hey, you get electors based on how many members of the House of Representatives you have, plus how many Senate seats you have, which everyone has 2. And so that number matters a lot. And so I wanted to hear your opinion. What do you think is the real implications of the census being mismanaged this year, and what that can have as an impact for democracy for the next decade? Because the census is only operated every 10 years.
Right. I mean, it goes back to everything we just talked about: voter suppression, gerrymandering, just keeping people out of the process. And again, if that's the only way you can win is by keeping others out, that's a big red flag. There's something wrong with your platform. Maybe evolve, and then you don't have to try so hard, to disenfranchise people. But the politicization of the census and how just overtly racist. Can we say it? He's so overtly racist.
Yeah.
What he was trying to do, and it does have a ripple effect there. I mean, we're going to be seeing Trump's fingerprints on a lot of stuff for a very long time to come. And it has real ramifications. Like, you know, when he got elected, I kind of laughed. I'm like, wow, we really are in an idiocracy. But like, I'm not laughing anymore because he bragged about rolling back more regulations than any president, you know. So it's terrifying what happened, and he was unapologetic in his corruption and just overt attempts to overthrow democracy and suppress it.
Yeah, and you know, I truly wonder if the whole reason why that was done was not necessarily the economic funding reasons, but as a true power grab, because it's going to be able to help probably, I would say, secure more electors for red states. Because I will say a lot of immigrant communities generally come to bluer states because they have higher urban populations and more job opportunities, and well, also sometimes more tolerant cultures too, towards those immigrant communities. But I think like one of the other implications beyond immigration is just like some of the groups that might have almost like difficulties in the process or are having almost like a manipulation of data. Like for instance, the other group kind of tied, like both are considered, you know, they call it illegal aliens. Well, the other group that's kind of criminal is like people who are in our criminal justice system already. And so that is a frank point of view where we have people who are pulled out of their communities when they commit crime and basically put into jails that are outside of their original communities, and their vote is moved with them, or not their vote, their filling out of the census is moved with them. And that pumps basically resources into those communities that have the jails and pulls resources from communities where these people were taken from. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities that come from these groups who are normally disenfranchised. They don't have as much power because they've been incarcerated or they're undocumented, and they could potentially be exported for that or deported for that. They're not a good or service, so I apologize for that statement. Yeah, it's going to cause a massive divide in power dynamics. So I think it is important.
It's a resource suck. It vacuums resources and representation from one area, puts it into another, and one side obviously is more detrimentally affected than the other. One it almost is good for them. So
yeah. And so I guess the other part we were mentioning before is just the Electoral College in general. And I think one thing that needs to be tied to this, because so much of how the Electoral College is constructed is based off of combining the votes for the House and the Senate, and they also get to include DC in this vote. But the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, which basically said we will only have 435 House of Representatives members. It set a firm cap, and all the apportionment has happened since then. I wanted to ask you first, Jackie, what is your general feelings on the Electoral College? Do you think that's something we should keep? And if not, do you think we should be doing anything still with the Permanent Apportionment Act? And if we do, like, do you also think we should be repealing the Permanent Apportionment Act?
Yeah, think about this. Donald Trump and George W. Bush lost the popular vote. We would not be in the forever wars, and we wouldn't have gotten, well, you know, like that's debatable, but he did, you know, like George W. Bush did get us into war with Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. Let us everybody remember that. So the fact, and when you talk about democracy, certain people love to point out that we don't live in a democracy. We live in a democratic republic. And that is somehow supposed to make us feel better about not being represented or about our votes being suppressed. So we need to abolish the Electoral College. We need to have a direct democracy. The Electoral College is disproportionately favors rural, predominantly Caucasian. You have these areas that are sparsely populated, and they still get 2 electoral votes.
At least
Whether
3,
there's
because they get the 2 from the
right,
Senate and the 1 from the House. Yeah, at least
right,
3.
right. So it's just really frustrating because these populations are really sparse, and even and then these giant, huge states that are really diverse. It's like one California voter versus one Wyoming voter. That the Wyoming voter, I think, is like 37 times the power of the California voter, because they don't. So it's like, it's not, again, it's another way to repress and suppress people's representation. So and the popular vote, it's just, Donald Trump should have never been our president. He didn't win the popular vote. And the fact that he did get in there and then just cause havoc, and 500,000 people are dead now from COVID. Imagine if we actually had the popular vote, and Hillary Clinton, I'm not a Hillary Clinton fan, but I guarantee you she would have done a better job managing COVID, and 500,000 Americans wouldn't be dead right now. I really don't have any doubt in my mind that that's true, because, one thing, that if there's ever a time that you need a strong central government, or politicians that actually know what they're doing and have connections with all these different areas of, it would be during a deadly pandemic. So the fact that he was an outsider meant that he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and it showed. So the popular vote should be what a democracy. I mean, we should have a democratic country. We should be a democracy.
Yeah, and I will say the one stat of like the power dynamic for the Wyoming, you're just off a decimal place. Basically, a Wyoming voter has 3.7 times the power of a California voter. But you're absolutely
I'm
right.
not a math person.
Yeah, it's just a decimal place slide. So it's basically, I fully agree with you. Some stats that we can basically look to when you look at the past elections, 6 out of the 7 were not basically determined by like who won the popular vote. Or no, that's not the right one. It's like basically you had Bush win on the Electoral College and on the popular vote in 2000. You had it, I think, again with Trump, and I think we even had it beforehand, I think, with HW. But I have to verify that. I know with the Electoral College in 2016, when you look at the actual breakdown of like if you just move to like, some people propose like the proportional model, where right now, like most states, other than I think it's Nebraska and Maine, just do a winner takes all of all their delegates. Some people say that we could simply, make it so no one feels like their vote is wasted by making all states proportional. Like, for instance, I live in New York. I can confidently say that New York is going to go blue in almost every election cycle. And so there is not a lot of reason for me to want to vote in that presidential election, because it just doesn't feel like my vote counts as much. And so these proportional folks say it will at least, give you that. But like when you look at how would that have changed the election for 2016, even under a proportional model for every single state, Donald Trump still would have won by the Electoral College. And I don't think a system that says millions of people more voting for the other candidate being invalidated and losing is a good system. There is no reason why a rural voter should have more weight in how this country is run than an urban voter. And that, as you just said, is going to create disparities on racial lines. Because as we said before, there are higher, minority communities in urban areas because, well, that is where the jobs are. That is where the welfare services are. And frankly, that is where a lot of people first come into the country, because those are the central hubs. So yes, I think that there is a reason for that. Some people will say that it will lead to people not getting attention in rural America. People will just simply go to urban hubs. And I will say this: if everyone's in the same area, you're not getting a good bang for your buck working in that area. You want to try and build up all the votes. If like everyone in the nation is being ignored and one candidate says, you know what, I'm going to go through this royal tour, you're going to clean the fuck up.
Yeah.
then you're
Yeah.
going to have a massive advantage. So
Yeah.
I fundamentally reject that it's going to completely ignore them. And this is, again, we've said this, sometimes to some people, equality feels like oppression and they got to get over it. We're just asking
Right.
for equality here. Every person
Yeah.
has one vote and that land doesn't
Yes.
get a vote.
Correct.
So, yeah, and I want to turn to that second part of the question that I had asked. The Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, which sets the firm cap of 435 seats.
How many?
So, I mean, this has a problem in my mind where it basically is another way you take away power from highly populated states.
Right. How many people were in America in 1929 versus now? Like, what's the population growth since then? This is the thing, we need to evolve. It's the 21st century. Anything that we're talking about 100 years old almost maybe needs to be reviewed, maybe needs to be assessed and see if we're doing the best that we can right now. So
yeah.
I don't know why we're so scared of change when we have, computers in our hands and all this stuff. I mean, all of the things that we have available, we're like, oh no, we can't change the Electoral College. It's like, yes, we can and we should, because it's the 21st century and we live in the age of information and we know better. You're supposed to do better.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, it's also on a simple level of like, how many people is one representative going to represent? Right now, the ratio is something like 1 to every 736,000 people. Like, it's going to be harder to represent people when you have to represent more people. I think that's a pretty easy thing to understand. It means there's going to be more diversity, and so it makes it harder for one individual to properly capture all those different people. And so when you compare us to other nations, we have other democratic nations. We have a significantly higher ratio of citizens to representatives. The second place country, Japan, has roughly a 3 times smaller ratio than us, and they're the second highest.
It's like teachers in classrooms. Like we don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough representatives.
Yeah, it's exactly true. And how do you expect them to go out and listen to all of those constituents? It is literally impossible. And also,
especially when they're calling for dollars all day long too.
Yeah. And I mean, here's the problem too. Like, the larger the district, the harder it is, like, as a barrier of entry to compete, because you need more money to be able to spread the message out to more people. So that makes it even harder for any working class person to compete in states, because they need more money to just compete in larger districts. Yeah. And so my opinion is that it should be repealed, and then we should try to target at least moving our representative level to something like Japan by tripling the number of representatives we have. Because I think that'll also do a significant job, like helping the Electoral College, because that'll fix the power imbalance between states like California and Wyoming, because it fixes the House of Representatives numbers so that they're, again, actually properly distributed. So I think that is an easier thing to do, frankly, than repealing the Electoral College, because that, unfortunately, is going to require like a constitutional amendment, which might require a constitutional convention. But repealing the Permanent Apportionment Act, that's just a bill. That's a normal repeal. And that can make a big impact on the Electoral College in my mind.
Yeah, and having more representatives, you have more of a chance of actual diversity and people being more representation, getting more in there.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing to say is obviously we want the dark money out. We just talked about that before. But by having more representatives in the system, it at least makes it more expensive for them to try and buy everyone.
Right? Yeah.
So that's another little benefit. But let's now go to our next subject. We want to talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So what this does is it basically is trying to say that the federal government should have some oversight over states and localities to make sure that they're not implementing laws that are basically discriminatory. And so it has three basic parts. It modernizes the Voter Rights Act formula to determine which states and localities have a pattern of discrimination. It ensures that last-minute voting changes do not adversely affect voters by requiring officials to publicly announce all voting changes at least 180 days before an election. And third, it expands the government's authority to send federal observers to any jurisdiction where there may be a substantial risk of discrimination at the polls on election day or during an early voting period. So, Jackie, I want to ask you, in your opinion, we've clearly been talking about how they have had these disenfranchised communities. Do you think, in general, extrapolating off this, that the federal government should have more authority over how elections are run? Because right now, most of the responsibility of how a ballot is administered and the way they vote and can you do it like through the mail is determined at the state levels. So do you think the federal government should have more authority over how elections take place?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of standardization. So like the more that we can streamline and standardize things, the easier it's going to be, the less confusion, the you can, educate in mass instead of having to specifically have a website for each, state on how to vote. Maybe we have a standard procedure. Like I know we're going to talk about primaries, but that is such a mess. And if any, of course we need help in primaries, and when it comes to voting, yes, there are some things I think the government should be involved in, should have authority over. This whole states' rights thing, when we talk about states' rights, coming from Texas, we're talking about the states' rights to oppress, suppress, repress other people. A lot of times that's what we're talking about when we're talking about state rights. So yeah, I'm a big fan of.
I think the one benefit to me of something like standardization is when we talk about what we were just talking about before, which is the idea of a national popular vote being the way we determine the presidency. If you do not have a level of standardization, that can be particularly difficult to administer because, for instance, let's say one state has ranked choice voting and another state doesn't. How does that apply if you're not just determining it for your own state, and then those electors are then passed on if it's just a national popular vote? You have to have like a standardized method of administration. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And so, frankly, if you support the idea of a national popular vote, you have to support a standardized national ballot for federal elections. And this is part of that.
Yeah, that was another thing I think that this last election showed us. There were a lot of room for improvement when, people could vote early, but those votes wouldn't be allowed to start being counted until the polls closed. Like all kinds of weird stuff. Every state had its own little quirks and idiosyncrasies, and again. And we didn't know, who won for days. And so we have that kind of streamline. We can make the rules. We can make it as, safe, but also fast. And then we wouldn't have all this, that would be, when you talk about having faith in the system, that would go a long way towards shoring up.
I was thinking about that too myself. Like you think about all the challenges that had been occurring in the verification process of the Electoral College. It was all based off of, well, are these state directors going by the book? And so maybe a little bit of standardization and federal oversight can assure some trust that you don't just have these quote unquote deep state officials trying to overturn elections. I think some standardization would build a long way of trust. But let's go now to some of the other measures that we wanted to talk about. And I think the first one I wanted to bring up is ranked choice voting. How we vote. We were just talking about this before. of, you wouldn't be able to necessarily do one system in one state and another system in another state if you had a national popular vote. But I think we both agree that the first past the post system has inherent flaws in it because it basically forces you to pick in the duopoly sense of like, oh, you're not voting for us? Well, you're helping that person.
Right.
And so ranked choice voting is the style of voting that generally has caught on a little bit more momentum of the alternative voting systems, including having bills on the federal level, like the Ranked Choice Voting Act, as well as having several states who have already implemented ranked choice voting and several states who recently passed ranked choice voting via initiative. I know, for instance, like I've been covering Andrew Yang's election. This is the first time New York City is going to have ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
So it's definitely the most popular, but there are some other methods as well, known as star voting, range voting, and approval voting. All of these would be potential replacements to a first past the post system, which is just you picking one. And so I'd like to ask you, Jackie, do you have a preference for voting style? And is there any particular reason why you have that preference?
Yeah, I would love ranked choice voting because as they've shown, I think it was Maine or Vermont, one of the northeastern states, it was such a more peaceful, nice, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but it wasn't such a dirty election where there was a lot of mudslinging because it looks bad and maybe people won't put you as their second or third choice. So it's a kinder kind of voting, and maybe we wouldn't see so many fear-mongering ads and ridiculousness if we had adopted that nationwide. And then also, I am an independent, I'm a green. I do not like supporting either corporate establishment party. And, this last one, I did suck it up and I voted for Biden because there's no way in hell that there was a possibility of Texas going, blue. So I did my duty. And a lot of people are like, oh, you're just supporting, I mean, Obama's the reason why I'm not a Democrat anymore. So the fact that I voted for Biden, Obama 2.0 is like kind of ironic, and it feels like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're in a rock and a hard place. So I would love to see I've been begging progressives, like real progressives, to go green for forever. And if we actually didn't have to like fearmonger, oh, well, if you go green, then you're just gonna get the Republican elected. And I was blamed. I think I did not vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 because I'm in Texas, and it just
I did the
it's
same
no point.
thing.
Yeah. So I voted green because I did, but
I'm in the same boat. I voted Biden in 2020 and I voted green in 2016. And it really does come down to, in my opinion, it's just like we don't want that shame, but their point isn't actually technically wrong. Voting third party does make it a little easier for the other side to be able to accrue the victory compared to voting for that quote unquote
and it feels like a waste.
Because because it's like it's built into the system. Like that is literally how it's structured. It's just how many people chose you in first place. And so, my personal preference is I like star voting. I support ranked choice voting, and I would push it because it has that national attention, and we need to go as quickly as possible to a new system. So star would take a while to potentially build up that education. But the reason why I like star voting compared to ranked choice voting is that there's a little bit less gamesmanship in the way you rank. So for instance, like take the 2020 Democratic primary. I obviously like some of the more progressive candidates. I like the Andrew Yangs, the Bernie Sanders of the world. And I didn't want necessarily the Joe Bidens or the Pete Buttigieg's to win, but I wouldn't say they were also my like least favorite. It's just that they were like the contending candidates that I wasn't big fans of. And so in a gamesmanship sense, ranked choice voting might have me put those people at the end of my list compared to in their proper position of like on a policy level how I think they are, because I want to damage them potentially as an opponent and not have my vote flow to them. And so that is a potential consequence of that type of a system. Likewise, there's also the pressuring to make sure that you include one party on your ballot as the second option. So you're still going to get a lot of potential like shaming to say like, oh, you're not going to put our name on the ballot. Star just allows people to simply give a ranking to every single candidate, like just a grade. And then from there, they have a single runoff to basically make sure that, that there is still some like preference of not just like it's everyone's middle, but that there is a lot of people who feel like passionately for it. So it's like a lot of people might like, if you don't know the candidate, for instance, you might say, oh, I'm going to rate this candidate a 3. And that's not necessarily a good thing if you just get the person who like no one knows about win because everyone rated them a 3 because they just didn't know them. So you want to say, okay, who had the more like ahead votes? And so that allows actually, frankly, a little bit of that first past the post system to say, well, we want to vote for someone we feel strongly about and care about. And so ranked choice voting in these other systems might get you to have your vote technically cast for the person you're not as passionate for.
Right.
So I generally like Star. I don't think ranked choice voting is bad. I know some Star advocates try and say, no, it'll just put us back further. I would say full steam ahead on ranked choice voting. As soon as possible, we can move away from first to past the post, the better. And my favorite benefit of it is just we're going to have way less negativity in campaigning because you now have to care about that you're not just getting someone's one vote or you're disencouraging someone from voting for someone. You have to get a higher score. You have to get higher on someone's list. And if you attack someone, their supporters are probably less likely to want to rank you as highly.
Right.
So I think that's a very nice thing because our politics is just a little bit too negative and divisive in my opinion.
With Star voting, is there still primaries, and are the primaries Democrat and Republican primaries? I mean, I guess we'll get into primaries.
Yeah, it's just like it's basically just a different way your ballot would be basically presented. Mm-hmm. And so you'd basically, instead of having like 5 slots and you write names out in each slot, you would basically have a 1 through 5 next to each candidate's name, and you would bubble in the grade you give to the candidate.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool too, for sure. But yeah, anything's better than winner take all right now. That is like definitely disenfranchising and discouraging a lot of people from participating at all. Like you're like, well, I hate both of them. I don't want any. And then if I vote third party, it doesn't matter anyway. So if we can actually have some kind of ranked voting in any form, then you might have more people participating because, they'll feel like they actually do have a say.
Yeah, and I will be very frank. I mean, that is the main reason why I am a Democrat right now, is just because we don't have an alternative voting system, and my vote kind of does feel wasted if I throw it to a third party, and I don't feel like I'm helping protect against risk, which is important. And so if we had ranked choice voting, star voting, or anything like that, probably not be a Democrat. I would just say that. Like, obviously, you need another better party. Green Party is a solid, I guess, alternative for that. But
DSM.
Yeah, it's the voting system that's keeping me in place.
And it is making things way more divisive. And we have an article coming out down the pipeline about the duopoly and being an independent in the duopoly by James. So that'll be an interesting read.
Yeah. So let's move on because we have a lot to cover and we've gone hour 20 so far. As you can tell, there's so many different aspects to democracy. There's so much to cover. So let's go into the next part. We were referencing this before, the Democracy Vouchers Act, the idea of publicly financing campaigns. Basically, the idea is you give vouchers out to people that they can give to candidates to be redeemed. You can split it up however you so choose. The actual bill itself says that it breaks it up into 4 increments. So it gives $100 to people broken up into 4 increments of $25. Ideas like democracy vouchers is already implemented in 26 cities and states. One example is like the West Coast study done by the West Coast Poverty Center, basically doing some analysis on the implementation in Seattle. They basically found that the voucher users, the people who are likely to use these things, tend to be less likely to be high income, and they're more likely to come from just, poor neighborhoods in general as well. Furthermore, they also say a lot of older residents will tend to be the users of these democracy vouchers as well. And so this kind of provides a little bit more of an egalitarian sense of financing, more poor people being able to participate in elections, but it's not necessarily going to fix the whole representation problem because old people still will participate in politics more than young people, as this program is clearly showing. And some of the impacts they basically said from the program they determined is that it gives people more choice because, candidates who otherwise, would not have the resources to run, but maybe have good ideas can now run for office because it's easier to finance their campaigns. It gives you and fellow citizens an easy and fair way to participate in local democracy and level the playing field, allowing all citizens to participate as both a voter and campaign donor. And finally, it gives you more trust in the political process by knowing how candidates are funded. The election transparency website will provide graphs and tables tracking democracy dollars, cash contributions, and campaign expenses that are easy to read and understand. So yeah, it's not just that hey, we now have more power to fund the candidates who are also running. A cool thing is just more people are going to be willing to run because now it doesn't seem as impossible to get off the ground.
Yeah, I know I know that it costs money just to apply to run.
Yes.
So
yes.
Does that cover something like that? I mean, is there scholarships?
No. Technically, no. So what would happen is when you run, there's different phases of running for office. So there's basically the exploratory committee part, and then there's the actually running part. And during the exploratory committee part, you are allowed to fundraise for a campaign, but there is a limit on how much you can raise. I know, for instance, I think I had a $5,000 limit of how much I could raise during that period. And you usually use that to finance those types of things of getting on the ballot.
Okay.
So you would still be able to have the democracy vouchers eligible for that. So yes, that would help people trying to get onto the ballot. So yeah, I think yeah, there should be no reason why that couldn't be used to help get people onto the ballot.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, when you give people money and they can literally have skin in the game, I feel like the democracy vouchers would really get people motivated to participate more, not just running, but also support people and maybe volunteer and stuff like that. It's almost like planting a seed of participation. So, when you start, I know I started getting politically reactivated with Andrew Yang, and I mean, he was the first person I gave money to since Obama. So Obama's first term. So that was pretty being when you give money to a campaign, you're literally invested. So yeah. I see it.
Yeah, and that's actually an amazing point. It's if you're just given this thing, it kind of forces you to think about the election. Because it's I have this use it or lose it thing. And I think most people, when they get something for free, they want to use it, especially if it's time limited. And so that kind of forces people to have to look up who's in the race to know how to use it. Yeah. Now, I actually one of the proposals that Kirsten Gillibrand, my U.S. Senator, has proposed, which is it's an expansion of the Democracy Vouchers Act that adds an additional 100 on it, and that additional 100 is only allowed to be used on local and state politics. You'd have 100 that could be used for federal, and you'd have 100 that could be used for state and local. And I like that because it provides the incentive to care about elections that frankly people don't care about as often.
Yeah, and you're gonna wash out those lobbyist dollars too. I mean, double our money. It takes away a little bit of their power.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the statistic that Andrew Yang used on the campaign when he ran on the idea of, he called it democracy dollars instead of democracy vouchers, that it would basically provide an 8-to-1 ratio over existing dark money that would basically give. And so if you did what Kirsten Gillibrand said of giving 200 to everyone, well, now that's a 16-to-1 ratio. And so, yeah, that would really mitigate the power of dark money over our politics. But I want to now go to our next area because I want to make sure we can get this quick so we can get to our conversation with Adam Christensen. So the next subject's term limits. And so there's a lot of debate on this, frankly. Like even some progressives are like against term limits because it like helps build up potential experience for these people. And so like some of the benefits that people would say of implementing term limits is that, you know, restricting the service of lawmakers prevents politicians from amassing too much power in Washington and becoming too alienated from their constituents. Because, you know, over time, as a politician, you are constantly relationship building. You're constantly building up a war chest for future elections. And so you're constantly trying to keep this career alive and building up these connections. You amass so much power. It's so hard for people to be defeated. I know for a fact most incumbents win 91% of the time.
Yeah. And even when their approval ratings are in the 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's very weird.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thinking is that like many lawmakers, you know, view the work as a career and not a like temporary assignment. Like it didn't always used to be a full-time career. Like a lot of people would go back and like be farmers and such back in the day when the founders were like drafting our representative model. And so therefore they're spending so much of their time like posturing, raising money, and like focusing on re-election campaigns that they're not doing the thing that we actually want, which is focusing on legislating.
Yes.
So those are the arguments for. And then like some of the arguments against the term limits is usually like, we already have term limits as a concept. They're called elections.
Right.
You know, the primary case against like term limits is that, you know, indeed our elected officials in the House and Senate must face their constituents every 2 years or every 6 years and get their approval. And that by imposing term limits, you're basically putting an arbitrary law in place that might be preventing people from having a representative that they want. You know, let's say a popular lawmaker like Bernie Sanders was in place and they had a 12-year or an 18-year term limit. Do we still know about him as like the presidential candidate, or did he move on with his career? Is he now the budgetary budgetary chairman? I don't think so. He's probably out of office now. So I want to ask you, what's your position on term limits?
Well, you know that the whole we have an election, that's the term limits, falls flat on its face, considering the conversation that we just had about suppression and voter disenfranchisement. So that is just, we can just say like, that's not a great argument. I think we also, what was like, DC is one of the richest zip codes in all of America.
Yeah.
So when we talk about out of touch, these people are living lives that we can't even imagine. You know, like as a Texan who just spent a week with power coming on and off, they do not. I mean, Ted Cruz went to Cancun. That's how out of touch these people are. So term limits, yes, probably like 12, maybe 16 years, because one of the arguments is like, well, you can't do very much. It takes, you know, time to like cultivate these relationships and work with people and like really
and understand the laws and the technical procedures and such. Yeah,
it's really interesting watching Cory Bush get into office and her talk about the rules of talking on the floor and how just pomp and circumstance everything is. So it does take a while to get acclimated and understand all the ritual that it goes with it. So yeah, you know, it shouldn't be like just one term and you're done. But you also, again, shouldn't make it a career. It shouldn't be something. This is supposed to be your duty as a citizen. So to turn it into some like profiteering, I mean, what are the statistics of millionaires in representative government? And they weren't. Most of them were not millionaires when they went into government in the first place. And a lot of people, conservatives, will point to that. My mom, you know, mentions that a lot, that all these people are just millionaires and they don't really care about us. So I think, again, when we talk about trust and faith in the institutions, I think term limits would go a long way. And that is, I think, bipartisan. There's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle
Yeah,
that
and you
support
have,
it.
frankly, bills being put forward by Republicans on that matter. I mean, the one thing I will say, might sound controversial to some people, but like term limits might not be a good idea until we get campaign finance reform done. And my reason for saying that is that by having it be a process in which you can kind of keep getting yourself reelected, you become a little less dependent on what's that next job after you leave office. And you build up from that incumbency advantage, potentially a little bit more independence from your need for the donors because you've built up just simply name recognition. And so I think I am someone who thinks that term limits is kind of a blunt object. It's something that should be in the tool belt and something we should implement, but it is not nearly as pressing as, frankly, some of these other things. Now, for instance, term limits also has been talked about for not just Congress, but SCOTUS. And that is something where I completely think there does need to be term limits because those are not elected positions.
Right.
They do not face any election. And so we need to make sure that the courts aren't being as politicized, because right now they are, because if you simply get someone on the court, they're there for life. Yep. And so they'll do anything to just get someone there, because it's like, once they're in place, we now have power for decades.
Which we saw. The American people languished for months and months and months waiting for a stimulus, for some kind of bailout, and they couldn't do it, but they could put Amy Coney Barrett in the Supreme Court in 8 days. Yeah. And I will never, ever, ever get over that and never forget it. So yeah. And the Supreme and they put her there because they know she's an extreme conservative, and they want to overturn abortion, and they see her as a tool as a means in which to do that. And that is they think in the long term. It's and when we're talking about term limits, they're playing the long game.
Yeah.
And they have their eyes on the prize, and it's kind of scary how organized and how unified they are. Like, yeah.
Yeah, completely agree with you. So let's go to our next topic now. The idea of a national annual referendum. So some people might kind of understand this concept from their own state ballot initiatives that they have. 26 states have ballot initiatives in the United States of America. This is basically taking that idea and putting it on a federal level, and that you would have, a certain amount of pieces of legislation, potentially like what Tom Steyer was proposing, which was having like 1 or 2 each year that people would get to vote on. And, this is basically created as having like a compromise between having, Congress, this is basically a method of putting direct democracy in place, where it's could be a model in which the people are bringing forward pieces of legislation, kind of like a liquid democracy model. But it could also be more of a like representative model, where you have bills being brought up from Congress, and that, you might set a certain amount away for the annual referendum process. So this is basically there's a wide variety of methods of this being done. Like some of the models in which countries collectively have done this, like one of the most prominent is the Swiss Confederation. Basically, they say like on any political level, citizens can propose changes to the Constitution or ask for an optional referendum to be held on, any law voted by the federal or the cantonal parliament and or the municipal legislative body. And they basically say, like, for certain things like to the Constitution, those would require basically a double majority, in our terms a supermajority, to get that passed. And this idea would require a constitutional amendment, but this is like the root form of democracy. This is like what we were talking about before with Athens. Direct democracy is directly giving you a say on what legislation passed. So if you have trust issues with Congress, this just cuts straight through it and lets you vote on it directly. Yeah. I want to hear how you feel. Do you think we should be doing direct democracy, like fully, or just for through the representatives?
I
Like,
love
how
this.
do you
I
think it should be
want.
structured?
Yeah, I love this idea because I want to see, like, I think the majority of Americans like want marijuana decriminalized. So
Mhm.
I'd love to see that as a national referendum. Like making, I don't know if we're going to get to that, but making election day a national holiday. That's something that would I mean,
Yeah, that was
it would
part of
be
the For
really
the People
fun.
Act. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be really nice to. I mean, and you say, like, my vote doesn't count. Well, in these kind of referendum votes, you could definitely,
Oh yeah.
have your voice heard, and I think that would be really fun. That'd be really cool. I was thinking of another one. I can't think of what it was, but I'm like, ooh, that would be cool to do on a national referendum level. Yeah, but marijuana, that's a big one because
Yeah.
it's
I like
so crazy. The different states have different laws, and some people are sitting in jail for it, and some people are making buku buck in other states for it. It's just madness.
Yeah, and I think like the only thing like I would want to like kind of restrict away from being um like direct democracy stuff is matters of funding. I don't think frankly the people are the best budgeters. Um
Well, and I was thinking rights too, because
and
like
rights, yeah, like
would we
constitutional
want
rights.
abortion rights to be a popular vote? Because sometimes at one point
That's
slavery
how you
was
oppress the
okay
mute.
by the
Yeah, that's how
majority.
you're.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some things maybe that shouldn't, but some things that yeah.
Yeah, so I think like budgeting and constitutional rights, we can keep those off of it. But other things, yeah, fair game. Like we should let the
Yeah,
people have a
I'd
say.
love it.
Like I think your example of marijuana decriminalization, that's like a perfect example of something that would be a national referendum. So I fully support this measure. I'm
Yeah.
surprised that Tom Steyer was the only one who proposed it. But you know what?
And
That's why
and
some progressives like Tom Steyer. He had some cool, innovative ideas,
yeah, and
despite
that
being a
again,
billionaire.
yeah, participating.
Yeah.
That would encourage more participation, the more votes that we
Yeah.
had, and especially if it's something you're really passionate about, like cannabis. Like, oh yeah, I will be there.
Yeah,
So
and I actually think that does like also it focuses you on policy. Like right now, if all you get to vote on is people,
the person,
you're going to
yeah,
focus
yeah,
on people traits. But if
yes,
you're focused on
and
policy
the
because you're
party,
getting to vote on policy, you're going to start thinking about policy. And
and it
so
takes
I
the
think it's
party
going to
out.
focus the mind on more things. And yeah,
Yeah,
you're right. It takes the party out. So it's not like a
I love that.
partisan decision. Like I
Yes,
know you've told me this on many occasions when we even had our healthcare episode. Your mom being someone who likes so much of the progressive agenda, but then gets stuck on the freaking R versus D. She
right,
could still be our allies in this case and vote for
absolutely.
the things that we like.
Yeah,
So I think this is a great thing for
Mo-
us to do and getting
mom's
more
pro
representation.
cannabis.
so, so Jackie, let's now go to our final topic before we go to our interview. Let's talk about the primary process. So, yeah, so there's a lot to talk about here. The things that come to my mind are when it comes to like the presidential primary, the ordering of the states. Then you have the idea of primaries versus caucuses, how these systems, frankly, are administered, like the technology and how it's counted, and that private organizations are the ones that are like administering this. And then finally, that not everyone can participate unless you're registered in the party in some states.
Yeah,
So the first part is order. Right now, there had been some concern levied during the Democratic primary, first brought up by Julian Castro, that the ordering of the states predominantly favored rural white states, having
yep,
Iowa and then New Hampshire be the first two states in the primary.
yep.
I wanted to ask you, do you believe A, that is a problem? And then B, if you do believe it is a problem, what do you think we should be doing instead?
Yeah, it's a major problem because when we loved Andrew Yang, but also Bernie Sanders, whatever, the people that were, when you have predominantly rural white Caucasians making the decisions early in the process, and that essentially legitimizes whoever is running and whoever is ahead in those early things. And then so it makes a difference because those people start getting ahead in those early states, and then people start wavering or having doubts about the other candidates, even though they have the representation wise, it's not a really good pool. So I don't think that, I don't know why we can't do it all on one day. There's, again, you go to that standardization, streamlined process.
So
The coin toss that will live in infamy, you know, just, oh man.
yeah, so my only concern with like a 1 day idea is that I think it requires a much larger financing to be able to compete in that. Because like a lot of what campaigns spend their time and money on is go TV, go to vote efforts. And if it's all on the same day, that means you have to deploy all the money at one basic time. And kind of playing it out, it can almost allow certain candidates to like build up momentum and funding. Because it's like if you never performed and you have no indicators, people might think you're like a risky pick, but you perform well in one state and you can start building up some momentum. And so some ideas that I've heard, in addition to the one you had proposed, are two of these other ideas. One of which is rotation. You simply say like, hey, it's a fixed schedule. Certain states get a higher position during certain years, and you just rotate it so it's fair. Everyone gets the same amount of time in that first position. Another idea I have heard of is that you try to use, and who had presented this? I think Robbie Golden basically proposed this to me on our podcast at one point. He had basically suggested that we reward the states that have the highest voter participation rate from the previous election. That way you have an incentive to want to go out and vote, because that will then lead you to get a higher position in the ranks. So those are two alternative ideas. And I will say the reason why I think this is just important in general is I'm just sour that I never get to vote in a primary. I just don't get to. It's over by the time I get a choice to vote.
Yes.
And I will say, I was doing campaigning in New Jersey for the primary, and we were like, we were scheduled to be like basically the last state before the pandemic kind of screwed with the schedule a bit. But we had much higher like success rates with certain of these candidates. But we didn't get a say. Our candidates were gone by that point.
Yeah.
And so I do think that there does need to be some change to make sure that it's not just always Iowa and New Hampshire going first. Because right now what happens is you just have the states pick, and they just pick an order in which they get to go first. They just keep bumping it up until they are the first state.
Right. We could also we could do Iowa and New Hampshire, but also maybe put a more diverse state in that early time as well. So you wouldn't have to do all 50 states, but you could maybe do like a New Hampshire and California, or Iowa and Texas, or even Texas is kind of, but just make it a little more representative. I mean, I'm going to keep pounding on this forever, but when people don't have a say, and essentially if you're not in an early primary state, you essentially don't have a say in who the candidate is going to become. It just makes you not want to participate at all. So anything we can do to encourage participation and show more representation, we should be doing it, and we should be doing working really hard to get there.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. So I think the next process to talk about is we've been talking about how different states have their own different processes of how they hold elections. And one of the things that is kind of a disparity in the primary process is, do you hold a primary or do you hold a caucus? And so it is of my personal opinion that we should be eliminating caucuses, because I believe they are another form of voter disenfranchisement, because they require people to be able to stay in a room for hours and constantly be mobile, moving between places. And so this, frankly, disenfranchises the poor who would need to take out time to potentially secure childcare. And it's going to disenfranchise potentially community, like the disabled community, who might not be able to stay for a prolonged period of time. And it might not be as accessible or standardized, frankly. Like I know many a time in these caucus processes, they fucking flipped a coin to make a decision. That makes no sense to me. So
again, standardized. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So yeah, I think
anytime,
eliminating caucuses is going to make it a lot easier to standardize, and it's going to allow a lot more people to participate.
Yeah, anytime like humans are involved, there's going to be a greater chance of mistakes or, you know, mess ups and stuff. So if you take that kind of and I mean, it is cool because you're participating. It is active. I mean, I caucused for Obama in 2008 in Texas, but Texas doesn't do a caucus anymore. So they actually got rid of it. But, you know, it is neat to participate. But like you said, it leaves an awful lot of people outside.
Yeah, I agree. And it also has almost a little bit of a selection bias, too, because it generally will lead to candidates who have just like higher passion levels from their candidates, like higher enthusiasm, be able to do better, because those enthusiastic people are more likely to be willing to spend several hours at a time to be able to cast a vote for that person, compared to, you know, maybe someone is more liked by a general population, but they're normie people. They're not super enthusiastic about it. And so those type of people don't get as much of a say. I think the next problem that I see kind of in the process is just a general kind of trust factor. It comes from like the technology, and like we had seen with like the shadow application that was part of counting votes in Iowa, as well as the fact that just in general, primaries are run by like private organizations who can basically administer them however they'd like, as we have seen from court cases in 2017 from analysis of the 2016 primary and some of the institutional biases the Democratic Party did against one Bernard Sanders. I wanted to understand, in your opinion, like, how do we build trust in these processes? Because they basically have super delegates that can overturn things. They have complete control over what the thresholds are of polling. Like, I know, for instance, one of the things that a lot of the Yang Gang out there might know is how polling was administered for admission to the debate schedule for the January debates. It was so shady, and how they changed the timeline, and how there was basically no polls administered during that period of time. And that got him basically kicked off the stage and killed his momentum. And so I wanted to understand, in your perspective, like, how do you think we can improve like just the trust aspect, or even just like the representativeness? Because right now it feels like just we have private parties just choosing whoever they want in smoky back rooms.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the DNC did essentially to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and then with essentially coalescing all the establishment candidates coalescing behind Joe Biden. And, you know, there's a lot of people that say he's exactly what we need right now, transitional president, whatever. But the ultimate nugget is that it really wasn't chosen by the people. It was a game. It's chess, you know, and that doesn't feel like democracy. It doesn't feel like we're being represented when we do have so much momentum and passion, and we have people with good ideas, and because maybe they're not establishment, or they're, you know, outsiders, whatever you want to say, they didn't get a fair shake. That's incredibly frustrating, especially when, you know, their heart's in the right place and stuff. And maybe you can't say the same thing about the eventual nominee. So I don't know what we can do to like make it more fair and equitable. I'd have to think about it, but it's not right now. It's not fair and equitable. I don't have a lot of trust in the process, especially when, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice. that's why I'm not a Democrat. I don't feel like Democrats really have the people's best interests at heart. They are still a corporate entity. If you go to opensecrets.org, you can see just, the same amount of money is being spent on Democrats by corporations that's being spent, just different corporations, but it's depressing when you think about it, because right now, how do we get there? And is there anyone in positions to actually be able to change things? Like, if the establishment doesn't want anything changed, how is it going to get changed? How do we get people that aren't establishment in positions of authority?
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, one of the thoughts that I've had about like maybe how you can kind of get past this is like some states have basically like kind of like a jungle primary where it's like you don't have primaries by party. You kind of have all the candidates come in, and then you have the top candidates basically go to a runoff after that. I've heard similar ideas like final five voting, a system where like the top five candidates are selected and then they go to an instant runoff. So it's instead of two, you get five that continue onward. How do you feel about that? Like the idea of just general, like the jungle primary format?
Yeah, because when we talked about primaries for just Democrats and primaries for just Republicans, and I think in Texas, I can only, I have to declare, right, and then if I vote in the Democratic primary, I cannot participate in the Republican primary. I think that's kind of undemocratic, because I would like, if the Democrat doesn't win, then I would at least have liked to have had a say in who the Republican was going to be. So that in itself is,
because one of the things that I hear about that, like the frequent argument that's used like against that, frequently, I guess this is something predominantly that is an argument, especially in the idea of open versus closed primaries, is that like, oh, you'll just flood our primary and then pick someone, and that's not going to represent our real base. But it's of my opinion that that's how you lead to depolarization. It's someone who really represents everyone. It's not just like saying, okay, only Democrats get to pick this person, and then they're guaranteed to basically win the general election afterwards. And so Republicans have absolutely no say in those states, just none. And likewise, Democrats in these heavily red states have no say in those states. And so, if they can't get necessarily a jungle primary at least administered, they should at least administer a open primary in every state. You should be able to participate in any primary you want. And I think the biggest benefit of this is another prevention of voter disenfranchisement efforts, which is frequently people will see their voter registration party identification changed on them. I know this occurred many a times when I was talking to the candidates in Oregon. They had tens of thousands of voters have their voter registration not line up with what they thought it was. And so they thought they can participate in a Democratic primary, but then they couldn't. But if you had an open primary, that would not matter. They would still be able to participate.
Yeah. And again, that just having open primaries across the board, that makes it that much more universal. And aren't we like all about the universal basics? So like, let's have universal basic voting.
I 100% agree with you. So I think we've covered the gamut. We have now talked about every topic in terms of democracy reform. And here's the thing. We talked about a lot, and I'm sure there's more that we have missed. That is how big and vast democracy is. And as you can tell, we're very passionate about this. But we have someone equally as passionate that we're about to go talk to. We're talking to Adam Christensen. We're going to be heading into a conversation talking around the tactics because, again, a lot of these people came into place and got power in the existing system. And so they kind of want that system to stay in place. So how do you get them to make changes that might not be aligned with their own interests of keeping power? It was a very fascinating conversation on that, as well as like the power of data and how that really helps campaigns truly be able to win. So we had a great time with him. Jackie, do you have any final thoughts before we pass off to our interview with Adam?
One of my favorite memes of all time says, like, if voting changed anything, they'd have made it illegal. But essentially, they've been trying as hard as they can, to keep people out of that. So your vote does matter. Voting is the least we can do in a democracy. So if and when you get a chance, vote, vote, vote. We're going to have a special election in Texas because my representative, Ron Wright of the Texas 06 district, died of COVID. He was an anti-masker and he was pushing to open the schools and he died of COVID. So we're about to have a special election. So I hope all Texans are aware, if you are in District 6, that we're going to be having a special election, and definitely participate and make sure that you're registered. And let's get out there. And let's not, 2020 is just like, it was a big one. We can keep, we got to keep this momentum up. We can keep doing this. We have to participate.
Yeah, wholly agree with you. Let's make sure everyone uses their power and that we all fight for more power over a public say. So with that being said, let's now go ahead into our conversation with Adam Christensen. Okay, we are here with our guest, Adam Christensen. He is a former candidate from Florida, and today we are bringing him on to be able to talk democracy reform, because we've had him on in the past when we were talking at the Hill of Roses. We got to talk so much about tactics, and we know he's done a lot of, deep diving post-campaign, investigating how we've done our data management. So we thought, when we've covered so much in democracy reform, the biggest challenge we left off in when we were exploring is, how do we get them to do it? So Adam, I wanted to ask you first and foremost, when it comes to democracy reform, what are the first key issues that you think we need to target? Because I think with democracy reform, it's a lot about what things do we open up? Certain things make certain things more possible when it comes to democracy reform, because it doesn't change people's lives. Democracy reform is to get the changes possible for these other things to impact our lives. So what do you think are those first few things?
Well, I think that we've seen conservatives and Republicans do it for years. They lose an election and they rewrite the rules so that they win the next one. You're seeing it in Georgia right now, where basically they're like, oh, we got killed in mail-in ballots. Okay, let's fix that. Let's just make it harder to vote. Let's make it so you have to have two forms of identification. Let's make it so that we're going to shut down certain places where you can actually take your mail-in ballots. All these different things. As soon as they lose an election, they find a way so they don't lose the next one. Democrats don't do that. They win an election, like, we won, now we'll win forever. Instead of saying, okay, we won, we have power, and now we can actually rewrite the rules so that we'll have power for the future. And it's something that absolutely blows my mind that we don't do. And that's what when people say that Democrats bring a knife to a gunfight, I don't even think they bring a knife. I don't even think they know there is a fight. And they just get shot in the face and they have no idea. And that's basically what happens at every level, from their data to whether or not they actually want democracy reform, to being able to pass things like getting rid of felony disenfranchisement, all these different things.
Yeah, I think it's basically it's a will question. I think, Republicans, especially someone like Mitch McConnell, truly understood the importance of the mechanics of the game, especially when it came to the courts. So I think Democrats need to kind of learn from that lesson and say, yeah, we have to own the game. We have to make it a more fair system. We win when people can vote. That's the thing. So if we can just accessorize the people's power within our democracy, we can do a lot. I think the question I love...
It's not even that. Have you noticed what Democrats do? They see whatever Republicans did 20 years ago that worked really well, and then they say, oh, we should probably do that. But they're 20 years late. And so it's like, oh, Republicans won all these state houses, and that's really important for, writing the districts, which allows you to do gerrymandering. Oh, we should probably do that too. Mm-hmm. But they've already won the game because they've already gerrymandered the shit out of everything, and now nobody can actually win a seat. And even though Florida is going to get another 2 congressional seats, we're still knocked out of it because we still can't compete because they get to write the rules. I mean, it's the same thing that we're seeing now in Congress is you have power, write the rules, get rid of the filibuster, get rid of all of these different things that allow the minority party to have excess control. And that's something McConnell has done very well, is because he almost never has power, ever. And what he does is he understands, and that's why he got so good at rigging the game, is he knew I can't win by conventional methods. So I got to find ways that can give me advantages that nobody else can think about, and it'll help me in the end. It's the exact same formula Bill Belichick has used with the New England Patriots for years, and yet nobody else does it. It blows my mind.
This is one of those this year, though. I'll say the Patriots a little less successful this year.
Yeah.
This is one of those the Democrats not having a spine or wanting to play by those same rules is kind of like gives credence to these people who think that there's just two sides of the same coin. Like it almost feels like Democrats don't want to win. They don't want to be in power. And then when they do, they do everything in their power to bend over backwards to accommodate the Republicans. And it's very frustrating to watch us now again have a super majority and go, okay, where's our checks? Okay, like let's do some what about the voter rights act? Like, why haven't we just I know he's doing a lot of stuff and it's awesome, like what he's doing so far, but I just feel like sometimes they acquiesce over and over and over again, and they absolutely have a mandate right now.
Well, what's crazy to me is when Republicans get power, they claim, oh, well, we want to govern for everyone out loud on media to everyone. And behind the scenes, they're like, screw that. Why would we even do anything with them? We don't care. Yeah. It's going to fail anyway. So why don't we just ram through whatever the hell we want to do? And then guess what? We still win. It's this idea of marketing yourself and then doing whatever it takes to win. And that's the problem is Democrats, they have gotten this idea. And I don't know where it's come from because in a lot of Northeastern states, they got this down perfectly. They know what they're doing. We'll take like Alex Morse, right? Out front, it's unity. We like the fact that, we're having more voices come into the Democratic Party and we have some challengers and we have, people in the primaries and we have primaries, and behind the scenes, they do whatever it takes to win that seat and they don't care who they hurt. And yet Democrats at the national stage, I mean, what are they fighting for? Democrats are fighting to make sure that, we have equity. We actually have people that are able to vote, that we're opening up for a more democratic process, that we're able to make people's lives better, make workers' lives better, but they don't freaking govern like it. They don't do whatever it takes to make sure that that happens. They want to project like they care, but they don't actually do.
But it doesn't feel like they fight for us.
Yeah. And that's the thing. A lot of people, I think, right now are so not fed up with, understanding, is that you can tell us whatever you want to tell us to our faces, but if you don't do the things that it's going to take to actually make it happen, we don't care. We don't want to hear it. Right. And I think that that's where we're at.
So I love to ask you, it's clearly like a prioritization effort. I think you're establishing that it's not necessarily ignorance, it's willful ignorance, that they are purposely trying to not understand that. I have this theory that it's a self-regulation concept. They've been able to successfully get in the game. They've been careerists. They've been able to be there for some decades. The system works. Why do they need to change the system? And so I'd love to ask you, what are the methods that you think we should be using to make them actually do that regulation of themselves?
You're going to hate this and you're going to think I'm absolutely insane. I think they should do exactly what Newt Gingrich did when he became Speaker of the House.
Oh, boy. Okay. Make the case.
He created the Promise for America or whatever the heck it was called. Literally all he did was he went in. He had 2/3 of Congress. He rewrote the entirety of all of the rules for how Congress writes legislation, how they conduct themselves. He rewrote the rule book to the game so it favored his party. And then everyone else has decided, okay, well, we have to play within that rule book because he wrote the rule book in a way that the only way you could change the rule book is if you had 2/3 of the House. Okay, so what are the actual written rules and what are the unwritten rules? Throw away the unwritten rules. They don't matter. They're just convention and nobody cares because they're just there they're just there because people think they should be there, but they're not written. And if you want them to be actual rules, write them into the legislation or write them into the House rules or write them into the Senate rules. Do that. But do not put that up as an excuse for why things are not being done. Democrats need to go in and they need to rewrite the rule book.
Yeah, I'd love to, just challenge here because I agree with your point, but the devil's advocate that some of the Democrats currently, like the Kristen Sinemas, the Joe Manchins of the world, especially when we're talking about this thing like the filibuster, is that inherently we see this body be kind of a seesaw through history. Especially because the way the Senate is designed, every single state gets two regardless. So New York, California, we are getting two, and Alabama is also getting two. So, yep. I mean, not to say that Alabama can't be blue at some point. I don't want to write them off like that. Sure. But my point being, the Senate is inherently a body that generally kind of favors kind of obstructionist politics. Mm-hmm. So, how do you think we handle that when it comes to something like the filibuster? How do we convince the Mansions of the world, the Cinemas of the world, to buck their trend right now of saying, I'm not going to be on board with the rest of the Democrats?
You don't.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is you rewrite the rule. This is what I'm talking about. You rewrite the rule book. Oh, you don't want to get rid of the filibuster? Okay, let's make DC a state. Okay, there's 2 more Democratic senators. Oh, that's not enough for you? Okay, America Samoa. Let's make you a state. Puerto Rico. All right, let's split California in 3. I don't know. Let's make North Dakota and South Dakota become one Dakota again. Fixed it. There you go.
Some of that I think won't work. Just the states' right side of that, the breaking of states, but the rest of the adding, you're absolutely right. Puerto Rico just wanted to become a state, so they easily could become one. DC's asking for it, so there's a lot of places we could definitely add.
You have to have 51 votes in the Senate.
This is true.
51 votes. Joe Manchin, you either get rid of the filibuster so we can actually pass legislation, or we just throw in new states and we say to hell with it, because there's no rule that says you can't make new states. And if 50 million more people, Democrats already represent 50 million more people in the Senate than the Republicans, then tell me, how is that fair as far as governing goes? If we're going to go with that, then this is what I'm saying. Some things are written, some things are not. The things that are not written, like, oh, well, the written rule is you have to have 2 senators per state. Fine, keep that, keep convention. We'll add new states until we actually have the majority. And this is what they did with the Missouri Compromise. This is why they split West Virginia and Virginia. This is why they split the Dakota. Most people don't realize this is that we have the filibuster because it was using the Jim Crow relic.
Here's my only problem with this, because even with states, we still have to ratify them coming in. So we need to actually give that approval still. And so that might still be a challenge. So how do we start pressuring people to actually do that within our ranks? Because it always seems like we're going to have members. In my opinion, it's simply we have to grow the margins. If we have only 50 people, we are never going to be able to just do it because one person's always going to buck.
See, absolutely not. You want to know what? Have you seen what Kamala Harris is doing right now?
I'd go elaborate. There's a lot she might be doing right now.
She's had 2 interviews in 2 different states in the last couple of days. Guess which states those are?
Which ones?
Arizona and West Virginia. Did you see Joe Manchin's response today? He was like, they didn't tell me they were doing this. Can you believe that they're doing this? This is not how it's done. Oh, what? You're not going to back our legislation? Okay, well, you don't get a free pass. We're going to campaign in your state, tell people that you're the reason that you're doing this. And if you saw, I don't know if you've seen Corbin Trent's new super PAC. He was one of the first people with AOC and the Justice Democrats, but it's called the No Excuses PAC. And they started, as soon as Joe Manchin came out, was like, well, I don't know if we should have $2,000. They started running ads in West Virginia, hitting them on it. And did you see his tone change very quickly?
Oh, yeah. The infrastructure, the $4 trillion just came out of nowhere. He's like, oh, yeah, guys, I like money. Yeah.
He's like, well, we're Democrats. We like people to work for their money. Okay, fine. Then pass our legislation. You either get rid of the filibuster or we make new states. You don't like either of those? Guess what? Yeah. We're going to pressure you on your home turf. You don't get a free pass. This is not the Joe Liebermans of the world anymore. Yeah. We're in their heavily Democratic states, and they can do whatever they want to do, and nobody's going to say anything.
Yeah, you know what? This is something some people decried about Donald Trump, but it's effective. It's called being a leader. It's demanding your agenda try and get done. Yes, you still want these people to have a spine in the moments of judgment, but if the rest of your party's in line and this is a strategic element for the party, come on. I totally agree with you on that. It's just you need it from the top. Because you need it from the top, though. Because you need this pressure of either a lot of money pumping ads in or the Kamala Harris's and Joe Biden's to actually apply pressure.
Oh, there's no law against that, right?
Do it.
when you say there's 40 to 50 million more votes behind those 50 Democratic, and we now have the supermajority, there is a mandate. I do not understand why anyone in the Democratic Party would try to be against that. Like $2,000 checks, that's what y'all ran and won on. So deliver.
Yeah. And this is the issue that we're seeing right now, is the fact that they won and everyone knows that they won. And now Ossoff and Warnock are coming out to them on phone calls, yelling at them, saying, we won because we told people we would give them money. Now give them their damn money.
Yep.
Yeah. It's sometimes I always wonder what goes through Democrats' heads when they're leading on legislation. Like, I think one of the things I want to focus on next is like looking at the actual data behind what works and what doesn't. Because like one thing that's baffled me recently, and I don't want to dismiss that there is not action needed on this, but it's not what we ran and won on, and it's not necessarily our most popular issues, which should be our first issues. Joe Biden's first piece of legislation that he proposed to Congress was on immigration reform. I think that is a worthy cause, something that needs to happen. Yeah. But we ran and won on a popular issue of giving people money, and we just stopped the stimulus talks. Shouldn't that be the first ticket item? And right now we're hearing it's in April. Like, how do you think we manage that dynamic? Because it's like right now, I think there's been a large dynamic within the left of how far do you go in trying to challenge like your own party? Because like this is especially arose when it came to like the forced to vote idea. How do you think we play that dynamic out, Adam?
Can we not talk about that? I mean,
we already did.
But like, what is that balance of power challenging that we need to do with the party? Is it just calling them on issues?
No, you absolutely have to force your party. And this is one of those things. And this is, I think, what is absolutely beautiful and what most people at this moment just aren't starting to realize is you had all these people. And this is one thing that I lost my mind. They're like fraud squad, right? And I'm sitting there going, so AOC, Tlaib, and a couple others decide that they're going to go full out for basically decriminalizing marijuana and pass this bill. And the first vote, it doesn't pass. And you literally have the squad sitting outside the chamber taking notes on the Democrats who refused to vote for it. And as they came out, flipping their vote. And the very next vote, it passes. And ever since then, what most people don't realize is ever since then, the Democratic Party and like Pelosi and some of the others, they started to realize, oh, they know what they're doing. Not only are they popular, not only do they have the messaging, but they actually know what they're doing in order to push these actual things through committee and then into actual votes. And what you started to see is the $2,000 checks. That was a messaging thing from the progressive left. But who started to actually push that? It was the squad. And then you started to see other things like the impeachment vote. It was the squad. You basically all of the things that the Democrats have done now for the last 3-4 weeks have been headlined by either a progressive, Bernie Sanders, or a member of the squad. And the entire Democratic establishment is backing them now because they realize they have political power and they know how to wield it. This is the issue, and the thing that I really got pissed off with the force to vote is effectively what they wanted those members to do is to declare war on the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Throw a Hail Mary that will never work. And even if they did work and they got a vote, it wouldn't have passed because it wasn't written within the House rules unless they got exemptions. So what did they do? They said, let's get the exemptions. That moves the ball forward. And they're actually doing it. And so for me, that's exciting, but it also shows me that there is political staying power. This is the thing that most people realize. They're like, well, once we get Medicare for all, life will be done and we won't need any of these people anymore. I'm like, what? If you don't have people in the positions to keep the power and improve on the things that you already have, that a Republican comes in and knocks it out and tries to wipe it out like the ACA. Like, if you don't have long-term legislators that are progressives, that are the best in the business, and not just the marketing, but also the procedural part, you will lose long-term. That is why McConnell has won for so long, is because he understands the game and he's rewritten some of the rules so that he's the only one who understands how it works so that he can rig the game. The game is rigged for a reason. So rig it for yourself. When you have power, Democrats, rig the game in the benefit of working people and populism. That's what you need to do. And that should always, no matter what, be the very first thing on your agenda is how do we change the rules so we keep winning so we can actually pass the rest of the stuff we want to pass.
Yeah.
It seems simple.
And you know, I think one thing that's been a weird dynamic of this conversation is if you run as a Democrat, I think you want the Democrats to like you. That's how you stay in power. And so it's like, if you do this, which has clearly been an effort from the kind of People's Party effort wing, they want to create this divide. The staying power, as you just said, comes from having the things that the Democrats really like. And so some of these things like impeachment, you know, I think there's a more likelihood that it could happen and actually get, you know, convicted. But I'm not going to fool myself. I think it's still a hard task. But I think the messaging of leading on something like that, which is a very, let's just be frank, a partisan kind of idea right now, is something that's going to make them popular within the broader base of the party and be able to give them more staying power. And when you have likeness, like if you like AOC for just she's potentially representation or she is a team player with the party, but she has these popular progressive ideas, over time, you're going to listen to her and you, a Democrat, might move to the left.
1,000 people tune in on a Twitch stream explaining how effectively Robinhood app makes money through speculation and high frequency trading and selling off orders to a giant hedge fund. Like nobody else in the world has 300,000 people that just tune in to she's now a second term Congress person in general being like, here's how our system screwed up. Here's how we fix it. Here's what we should do. I'm sorry, but if you're going to get mad at that and say, oh, well, that she's not too far, or she's not left enough, or she's not creating waves enough, or she's not doing these things, there's a reason she is where she is. And there is a reason that effectively the People's Party is where they are. That's the problem right now is the best we can do and have seen in the progressive movement for the last 40, 50, 60 years is happening right now. And they are getting more pushback on what they are doing, which is what all of us want from the left than from anyone else. And yet they have death threats from members of Congress. You have Cori Bush out here being like, I've been verbally assaulted and my members of my staff don't feel safe, so we're moving offices. They had a storming of the Capitol, and yet even under those circumstances, they are still pushing forward with all of these things that we all want. And I'm sitting there going, how can you not see that they have actual political power? And that's what we've needed.
Yeah. I think sometimes they forget they're humans.
That too, yeah. And I feel like that whole force the vote thing was like asking her to create a hostile work environment too, because of what these people don't realize is they have to work with Pelosi and they have to
retiring in 2 years. Pelosi's retiring in 2 years, and literally the condition of her being House Speaker again was that she retires in 2 years and she steps out of leadership. What does that create? It creates a vacuum of leadership. Now, the other cool thing is, and this is not cool because it's the reason Democrats suck, is the fact that they have not actually brought up leaders in the past 10, 20 years, other than, as you've seen, Pelosi, Schumer, and a couple others, and they have not filled those voids, and they don't have people competent enough yet that understand the House rules and the Senate rules to be able to fill those voids, to be able to actually be effective leaders. But what you're seeing is from members of the squad is they got in, and the first thing they realized was, if I don't understand the game, I can't play. And so they've spent the last 2 years figuring out the game, and even people like Cori Bush, who were not in Congress yet, but knew they would be eventually, started focusing on how to play the game. And if you notice, I think Cori Bush has already proposed 2 different laws that could go through committee. That doesn't happen. And then you're seeing people like Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert. They will never pass a single law. It's never going to happen because they don't understand.
They're toxic.
They're just
yeah.
So, you know, Adam, I'd love to ask you, as I had alluded to beforehand, a little bit of the focus on the data. So, you know, some of what we are talking about is obviously tactical of the people that are already there, but we need to be focusing on also growing our ranks. I know you said, when I said we need to grow from 50, you're like, not possible. But I know it's a little possible. We can grow from 50. We have a lot of challenges. So I'd love to ask you, like, when you were going through the process, and this is something that you've been vocal online about recently too, data is a big thing of how you figure out how to run a campaign.
It's the only thing.
It's the only thing.
I'm convinced it's the only thing.
And so I'd love for you to have some of the folks out there kind of understand how we manage data for campaigns. Like, what is the data that you try to actually obtain? And then
Yeah.
how is that data obtained? Like, who currently has possession of it and how is it managed?
So there are two different options, effectively. You're a Republican, you're getting your data from one source, typically the Republican Party, who outsources it through two different companies that conglomerates it through and then does a lot of actual like data work to figure out, what is valid, what works, whether or not it's effective, whether or not the email addresses and the phone numbers and the voter data and the consumer data, that's all correct. And then you have the Democratic Party, which basically contracts out through one company, which is NGP Van, which anybody who has worked in any campaigns knows it's probably the worst piece of software that anyone has ever used. And it feels and looks like it was built 15 years ago because it was, and it really hasn't been updated since then. But the software is not the issue. It's an issue, but it's not the issue. The issue is that NGP Van, which by the way is run by two members of Debbie Wasserman Schultz family, contracts out to get their data from a firm that no one's ever heard of, that nobody really has any idea why they're contracting the data out from to begin with. But on top of that, that data in a lot of parts of Florida, specifically where we're at, was 80% wrong. As in, you're wasting 80% of the money you spend and 80% of the time you spend trying to convince somebody to vote for you simply because the data is wrong. And so for me, what we found out very quickly, because I got into the race that I was running on the assumption that if you have the right messaging, you will win hands down no matter what. If you make it easy, simple, marketing, messaging, that kind of thing. And then what I realized very quickly was, okay, the upfront cost to actually get data, to be able to contact anyone in your district and actually have it be right, where you call somebody, you think you know who you're talking to.
Oh my God.
And it's not that person.
And it's not even a good data. Yeah. I faced that same challenge when I ran. Jesus.
And you are fighting not just to raise money, not just to build a team, not just to do all these things, but now you're literally fighting just to make sure that the time that you are spending is not wasted. And so what I realized is the infrastructure itself to allow you to do the things that it takes to be able to run a campaign are the most important thing, and sometimes the only thing, because it doesn't matter what your message is if nobody ever hears it.
Yep.
The Democratic Party has that issue, and it's the reason that what's her name, Donna Shalala lost. It's the reason that Powell lost in South Florida. They can have whatever message they want, but if the other side is spending $1 for every $3 that you spend and getting the same marketing distribution effect, they can say whatever crazy shit they want to say, like all of us are socialists and we hate America, and you can't counter it.
Yeah, I volunteered and did a lot of phone banking and text banking for a couple different candidates this last season. And one of them, I won't go into specifics, but one of them was in a very red state, and she was actually using Republican data because it was so much better. And she was trying to kind of bridge the gap and say, you can vote for, you can be on the Trump train, but I share a lot of those similar values and stuff. But she was a Democrat versus the Democrat I was calling for here in Texas. It was maybe 1 out of 15 people actually I could talk to, and a lot of times it was the wrong number. You talk about bad data. You want to talk about waste of time. I was calling and calling and calling, and I almost never got a hold of anybody. When I did, it wasn't the right person. So the data was really bad, and the Republicans obviously have that a lot better.
And it's not just an advantage as far as winning campaigns, because it obviously is that. It's the fact that they can spend a lot less and be more effective. It's the fact that they can spend less time and talk to more people. It's the fact that they can do way less and spend way less effort and do way less organizing, and yet they're getting more votes. And so for me, unless you have decent data and decent infrastructure, there is no reason to run, because it's a crapshoot. There is not much you can actually do as far as changing people's mind or message or getting out there. And so for us, we bought Republican data, and the Democratic Party with a week left stole it from us and said, you're not allowed to use this anymore because we don't want you contacting Republicans, because if you contact Republicans, that means Republicans will vote more, which is a net negative for Democrats. And therefore, you're not allowed to use your data, which you bought from somebody else.
Wow. That is
In a +9
salacious.
Republican district. In a +9 Republican district. Because apparently, the only way I'm supposed to win this race is if I talk to Republicans, but I'm not allowed to do that.
That's ridiculous. So, Adam, I think my final question for you personally is, what do we do? Like, obviously, there's an issue. what do we do? Like, on a serious level, like, you're absolutely right. This is an issue that I face. This is an issue you face. Democrats across the country. It's obviously partially the DNC, and we have some new leadership there. But, like, what do you think the grassroots can even do to help their candidates on this problem?
So that's something that I've been struggling with even before our campaign ended. It was a question of, what does that look like? If we were able to do that, what would it look like? How would it be possible so that we could get the basic software and the basic data to as many candidates as possible with no upfront fees, so they can actually run an effective campaign? And yeah, you can make money off that, like on the back end or from donations or like a percentage or something. But if you put a barrier of entry to just having the basics, you're not equipping your candidates. And on top of that, a lot of people don't know this, but ballot requirements to just get on the ballot for a race in Florida to run for Congress, 11 grand or 5,000 signatures to petitions, 20% of which get thrown out because they don't match the signature and the SOE office doesn't like it. So really 7,000 signatures. And so I've been working on something since then. One aspect of it is basically online digital signatures that we can send a text message to somebody on the list and say, can you sign this? And all they have to do is sign it, get sent to the SOE office, and there's a petition signature. And try to do it as effectively.
So common sense. That's so common sense. It's like we have digital signatures that are so easy to do and such a common problem, because you are absolutely right. It's freaking signatures getting tossed out.
Yes.
Like,
and
just
so
make it digital and have that verification.
But the problem is a lot of states don't
God.
like digital because they're stuck in the past. And so you actually have to fight with them in order to get it approved so that you can actually have a system that does that. Thankfully, we have done that. And so for Florida, we're working on being able to do that at a larger scale. On top of that, being able to get them the basic canvassing software with data. That's also something that I've been working on ever since our campaign ended. And so I don't have anything yet. We're in the development stage and the beta testing stage. But we are hoping to roll some stuff out for candidates this year to test out, like 2021 with some of the mayor's races and other stuff, to test it out, figure it out, get the system in place, and then 2022 go as big as possible with as many progressive candidates, with as many people across the board, so that we can get basic data, basic institutions, and especially for candidates that the DNC and the Democratic Party just will not touch and they don't care about, especially like people in my race. Democratic Party didn't care about us unless it was making it so that we couldn't run our race. That's the only thing they cared about. We need to make sure that those candidates actually have an infrastructure and the basics so they can run. And what that does is it actually shifts the national landscape. You talked about Alabama someday becoming blue. The only way that's going to happen is if the people running in the heavily red districts start to change people. And the only way to do that is to be able to message, but make sure that message actually gets to people. And that's the hardest part, because until you build that infrastructure, we can talk all we want about all these grand plans and ideas, but what happened in Georgia will not happen anywhere else unless you have decent data, like Stacey Abrams was able to buy from Republicans through 2 different resellers and then use at a larger scale and clean up. Unless you do that at a large scale, you're never going to change anything. And not while you have talk radio and Republican-leaning institutions and media that's all they hear all the time. The only way to fight that is to make sure that you inundate people and basically blanket cover them with as much progressive media as they get Republican. Otherwise, you got no shot.
I just find it so hard to believe there's not more data companies with it's the information age. Like, there's so many companies that are just solely focused on data and analytics and all of that stuff. Like, how can we be so behind?
Monopolies. drives out competition. When a single company owns the entire market or the majority of the market share, there's nothing you can do. NGP owns the market on this side. There's two Republican companies on the other side. One's owned effectively by the Koch brothers, and it's the reason that a lot of state legislatures flipped. And then there's another one that's similar on the Republican side, but it's not owned by them. And some state parties use one, some state parties use the other. Democratic side, it's only one, and there's no competition. And the only times competition have tried to spring up to try to change it, they've gotten crushed. And that's because they're playing the same game as NGP is playing.
Yeah. Well, Adam, I want to say cheers to you on being another one focused on building up the basics. That's what we're focused on here, is focusing on these basic things. I want to give you just a moment. Is there anything you want to plug? I know you just mentioned that this is a project. Is there anything for people to go check out now to potentially get involved?
I don't have anything yet. Still got to work on finish up the website, but once we got something, we'll let you know. I'm sure I'll be blasting out on social media. And like I said, we're going to try to go as big as possible, because there should not be a single race, in my opinion, anywhere, not just the state of Florida, but in the country, including red states, where you do not have at least two people on the ballot and one of them is a Democrat or an independent who is left-leaning or progressive. That has to happen. And the easiest way to do that is through the populist way of petitions, making it easy and getting decent data to people so they can actually, through grassroots and small dollar donations, raise money. Because you have to change the fundraising structure. You have to change these basic things. And the only way you do that is with better data. And it's possible. And most people haven't thought it was possible, but now it is. And I think we got to do that.
Yeah, well, Adam, thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate you coming by and talking democracy and tactics with us, because frankly, I think we all know that the solutions are out there. It's all about just how do we start getting it done, and data and messaging, and so much of what we got to talk about is so vitally important. So thank you for stopping by.
Absolutely. And it was wonderful to meet you, Jackie. It's good to see you again, John.
Nice to meet you too, Adam. Thank you so much.
A rose by any other name still advocates just as sweet. Rosebuds, the hill of roses is no more. We are now the people's basics. In the coming months, we'll be rolling out a new website, our comic series, and rewards to help support our new startup, media, and technology venture. In the meantime, check out our new podcast, The People's Basics, with hosts Jackie Sawicki and I, Jonathan Munitz, where we'll be breaking down a different societal basic each week with our friends, colleagues, and experts. Join us, and let's get back to the universal basics. Please help us by appeasing the algorithm gods with a like, share, subscribe, and hitting that bell today. Stay basic, my friends.